Hi, everyone, and welcome to Housing-Based Case Management training series. My name is Ashley Halliday-Schmandt, and I am the director of the Northwest Michigan Coalition to End Homelessness. Today, I'm coming to you on behalf of the Michigan Balance of State Continuum of Care to offer training around excellent housing-based case management and crisis planning. Today, we're going to be talking about crisis planning. So if you've been following along through our training series, here are some of the things we've talked about. Today, we'll be talking about the crisis plan. All of these tools are using content from OrgCode Consulting. So let's jump into it. Let me just advance the slides. Look away if you get nauseous. Here we go. Okay, so if you're following along with our training series, last time we talked about productive home visits. And the 5 necessary functions in the first month of someone being housed. And one of those 5 necessary functions in the first month is to do the crisis plan. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So the crisis plan for housing-based case management is a tool for proactively preparing people for possible crises in their lives and ensuring that they have an active voice in the care that ensues as best as possible. So the crisis plan, once we see the form, it will really be centered around like a mental health crisis. But what I want to be sure that we're understanding is that it could be any type of a crisis that occurs in housing, and really planning and being intentional with your client around what will happen in the event that a crisis ensues. And so there's kind of no surprises around the care that they receive and the planning that goes into that. So what you want to do at first when you're first approaching the subject with the client is to normalize it. Normalize the fact that things will happen once people become housed. Things are going to happen in housing that clients may never have dreamed of happening. But they happen. And so how can we plan for that? And how can we support them through that crisis while still maintaining their housing? Ideally, you will complete this with the client in the first 2 weeks of being housed. And I say ideally because the sooner you can do this, the better. That's what I'll say, because, you know, it is crisis planning. So if you do it, if you don't do it and the crisis happens, you don't really have this tool to use. You know, you're not going to do this in the event of a crisis. You want to do this prior so that you have something to look at and reference when the crisis happens. We update this as much as you need to. You get a copy as the case manager, the client gets a copy, and then you'll see in the form if anyone else is involved in their plan, that person would get a copy. And then the final update of this is given to the client at program exit. We'll do that when we talk about exit planning, but this is something that they can take with them even when case management is over. I'm going to try to zoom in on this a little bit here. And this is a sample. So this is one that's already been filled out. I'll also show you the blank version of this. But across the top, obviously, it's really self-explanatory. The About Me section, one thing that we did locally in Northwest Michigan was change the bottom part where it says healthcare number or health card number. There we put landlord/emergency maintenance line. So we just edited this form completely and thought that that was a better thing to put there. So again, feel free to change things on this. Just don't, you know, OrgCode has copyrighted this stuff. So these are their documents, but feel free to make something that works for you and your clients. We thought landlord or emergency maintenance is an emergency, right? If the place is flooding out or, I don't know, whatever other thing happens in housing and they want to know that number. Next, we have down here, obviously, emergency line is 911. It is not, it is not your phone number. It is not the case manager's phone number here. As you can see, the case manager's phone number is way down here. So we'll get to that in a minute. But In doing this, you really want to be intentional around telling the client, do not contact me, your housing-based case manager, in the event of a medical or life-threatening emergency. That is for 911. That is an emergency responder thing. So maybe you even want to talk about with a client, what would you consider a time that you would want to call me? And then just leave it wide open and let them talk about that. And then you can challenge or agree or whatever with what they're saying, but you really want them to understand that it is not you that they contact in an emergency, unless you are a provider who does have on-call services, who has a crisis function of their job duties, but traditionally we don't. Okay, so I've made that pretty clear. The other thing, just an example I would use, I think I've talked about this potentially in one of the other trainings, but as we go across the state and have done some of these trainings, I once had a case manager tell me that one of their clients went into labor and called them, and they were kind of in the middle of this person lived in the middle of nowhere. They wanted the case manager to come over, check and see, if they thought they were in labor, and the person did it. And so the person wasted, a lot of time getting to this remote area where this client lived, went over there, and then I can't remember what happened, if that person actually drove the person to the hospital or what, but there's so much wrong with that scenario, right? There's pretty poor boundaries happening in the first place. Second of all, we are not emergency responders. We are not people that, are dealing with medical emergencies. There are people for that, and we need to make sure that clients are directed to call them. After that, we can identify who the person would want to call next in the event of an emergency. In this case, it was the sister, then the person's boss, then whoever this person is, maybe it's a friend. Then comes you guys, support worker, and then support worker backup or team leader. So in the event that you cannot be contacted, you're on vacation, whatever, someone else at your agency who's aware of your cases who can be contacted. And what we've done also in Northwest is put over here as like a sidebar to the left, only contact the support worker when blah, blah thing happens. Okay, and you can come up with that. But typically we want them to go use this as like a ranked order. So first we call 911, if it's a medical emergency. If not, here's the order we go in. Depending on the situation, I may also use these community resources. A mental health hotline, huge to put there. A domestic violence hotline. I don't know. I don't know the scenario or what the crisis might be. If people are talking about, I might go into crisis because I might think about using. I'm sober now. I want to stay sober. That's an identified crisis for me. You could put, this person put Gamblers Anonymous. You could put their AA sponsor, whatever, whatever they're coming up with. It's client driven, so you can put there. And then here's where we start the conversation. And again, this is really a conversation. So you can look at this as just, hey, we're going to go over these questions, but let's just talk about this stuff. And really putting it out there that you are not afraid to talk about what a crisis could look like for the client. And that goes, a really, really long way. So you want them to talk to you about what the definition of a crisis is. This person is talking about gambling, could be anything there. And then things that cause me to go into a crisis are these types of things. So what are the things that happen right before this person blows all their savings and goes into debt? Okay. And I love this example because it talks about what might happen to their housing in the event of the crisis. So again, if you went through some of these other trainings in the series, you'll know that one of the things we always are asking is, what does this have to do with housing? How will this impact your housing? Same thing applies here. If they're talking about a crisis, we want to bring it back to, okay, that could be a crisis in your life, but how would that affect your housing? And maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And if it doesn't, let's try to think of something that would impact your housing, because that's what we're here to support. So this person is saying gambling affects their housing because they're going to potentially go into huge debt and maybe get evicted and end up on the streets again. Okay, so it's all, it tracks, okay? And then they were able to identify what are some things that might cause them to go into the crisis, which is great because then you have a place to work from around prevention. Continuing signs they are about to go into crisis. These are all things that are great conversation starters for you as a case manager, because then you can help identify these things, and you can say to the person, wow, it sounds like you're displaying some behaviors that are consistent with things you talked about in your crisis plan that might be indicators you're about to go into crisis. Let's talk about that. Okay. So signs that they're about to go into crisis, if it looks different for signs that they're in crisis. If you notice I am doing or saying some of these things, then give me space. In the past, this is how I've dealt with it effectively. And those are good strengths-based things to identify and build on. If I'm in a crisis, it's best to contact these people. And then if I am about to be in crisis or I am in crisis, these are the special arrangements or things that I need to have taken care of for me. So that one's pretty huge. And another reason or another thing I want to offer here is to be thinking about, with people who you're case managing, what happens in the event of a real emergency, like they pass away. Like you show up to their meeting or for your meeting and they don't answer the door. That's another thing. And you've gone X amount of times where you haven't heard from them via phone, you have not seen them. When do we need to start thinking about doing a wellness check on them? And a wellness check means you either get the landlord, the police, community mental health, whoever in your community it works, and doing this and actually go into the unit. And usually you want the landlord there because they have the key. We don't want to bust down the door, and to see if they're in there and if something has happened to them. So if that has happened to them before, what are the best ways to deal with that if that happens? Another thing would be what happens if they pass away. So we've had people in our area pass away after becoming housed, and we didn't have an emergency contact for them. And it's really, really sad, but it's a reality that some folks have truly zero connections to people in their lives anymore. And we had no one to contact that they passed away. We didn't have family. We didn't have next of kin. We had nothing. And so it took us a really long time to dig up anybody who needed to know that this person had passed. And that's a harsh reality of the people we're serving, but it is reality. So you want to be talking about that sort of thing with clients, like, can you identify at least one emergency contact for you? And then this is huge too. In the event of a crisis, I would like my crisis plan shared with my support network. Yes or no. And then if it's yes, down here, we've put another little box saying, I believe we've put this, saying who else should get a copy of this. And so if someone up here is an emergency contact, they probably need maybe not a full copy of this, but they at least need to know that they are listed as part of this person's plan. And it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that, hey, I'm a crisis or an emergency contact for this person. Okay, so that's just the blank version of that. So that's the crisis plan, and that's really all it is. And to just kind of sum this up, it is critically important to have this, even if the person doesn't struggle with a mental health issue. It's not just a mental health crisis. It's things. A crisis is anything that could immediately affect the likelihood that the person would be able to stay housed if this event happens. And how are we going to work through that? Okay, so that's crisis plan. Thank you guys so much, and come back for more trainings.